The thing about fantasy courts filled with glittering nobles and all their various politics, nasty or nice, is that they come in so many flavors. And those flavors range from the completely unrealistic good guys all the way down to the most horrifying, cynical exercise in showing that nothing matters except the elites exploiting our lives. Because that's the case, I thought that today, in the second episode of our series on world-building fantasy courts, we could discuss the iceberg of fantasy courts and their implementation. We'll start at the very top with the ones that are a little bit too good to be true, the ones that make us feel genuinely good about the ruling elite, and steadily descend down into the depths of the more corrupt, the more vicious, and the downright evil. If you're watching this on your phone right now, go ahead and tap that hype button or whatever feature YouTube is testing out this week to appease the algorithm gods. Like, comment, and subscribe, and welcome to another episode of Just in Time World Building with your host, Marie Mullaney. Alright, let's start at the hopeful top, the part of the iceberg above the water, the shining spires, where everything looks wonderful and the darker depths are hidden from us. In this category, we're looking at the courts that are overwhelmingly ruled by people with the best of intentions. Now, that is not to say that things don't go wrong. There are absolutely things that go wrong in these courts, and there are sometimes evil, scheming people operating in the shadows. But the rulers in charge and the people who generally win the stories are almost inevitably the good guys, the ones with the best intentions for everybody in the kingdom. In this category, we have the court of Tortal from the Tamora Pierce universe. The royal family there is, generally speaking, exceptionally well-intentioned. Even if they do sometimes have to engage in a bit of realpolitik, they still actively try to accommodate the best interests of their subjects, and even their spy masters are fundamentally decent people. Also in this category is the court of Valdemar from Mercedes Lackey's books. This is the absolute blueprint for this kind of high-trust court. The monarch, by the very laws of Valdemar, literally cannot be anything other than ideal, because they are chosen by a companion. A companion simply would not choose someone who is wicked, and they would actively reject a ruler who turned wicked. So even if the monarch is temporarily misguided or being led down the garden path by bad advice, they are still very definitively on the side of angels, trying to do the absolute best they can. So, that is our sunny top, the really pretty part of the iceberg. Now, let's slide down a little lower and hit the waterline. Alright, now we move down and we're talking about a more realistic court environment, but one that is still generally structured so that the good guys are more prevalent than the bad guys, even if the villains do sometimes come out on top temporarily. A great example of this is in Tolkien's main stories. I'm not talking about his earlier lore like the Silmarillion, I'm talking about the actual narrative of the Lord of the Rings. In these courts, the good guys generally win out, and the institutions themselves are fundamentally good. I mean, even Denethor was actually a capable leader who just fell off the wagon toward the very end under the weight of despair, and he was ultimately replaced by Aragorn, who was, of course, a very good king. Over in Rohan, we see King Theoden fall under a terrible corrupting influence, but the moment he is cleansed of it, he immediately starts making good decisions again. So it's very much a world where the good guys come out on top, even though bad things do happen, and bad actors will occasionally seize the reins of power. Another brilliant example of this, much as I love her, it's true that she's not super cynical, is Jacqueline Carey, the author of the Kashiel books. The court of Terre d'Ange is absolutely gorgeous. Now, there are flaws in this court, don't get me wrong. They're completely beauty obsessed, and they are extremely class orientated, and there are definitely dark underbellies to high society. In that sense, it feels much more realistic than, say, Valdemar or Tortal. But it is also a world where the spy masters ultimately have the best interest of the realm at heart, and the worst villains generally don't win. For the most part, the good guys come out on top, even when they have to make incredibly hard decisions and difficult choices, and the leaders genuinely try to make the best possible moves for the sake of the kingdom. I think that is the baseline for our waterline. Generally, good people are in charge, but there have been times when bad people achieve dominance through underhanded means, resulting in some crazy political shenanigans. For example, later in Carrie's Imreal trilogy, there is a period of time when the entire court of Ter de Ange falls under the control of a truly malicious magical spell. It brings out the absolute worst in everyone, and it gives us a very interesting look at Queen Ysandra, who is at that point being a terrible ruler rather than a good one. The thing about these smooth sailing courts is that they are fantastic. There is absolutely nothing wrong with having a non-cynical approach to politics or establishing a generally well-intentioned court. You're not going to be writing grim dark like that, of course, but if your aim is to write political fantasy where you have incredibly cunning adversaries, these courts are perfect. At the end of the day, your readers can fully get behind the protagonists and cheer for them as they eventually outmaneuver the antagonists, see through their complex schemes, or unpick the knots that have been tied around the court. These kinds of courts give the reader a powerful reason to invest in the politics and cheer for the characters. But this wouldn't be an iceberg video if we didn't plunge beneath the surface and talk about the maelstrom of darkness that awaits us further down. Just before we get there, give me one moment to tell you about Worldbuilding Blueprints. This is the comprehensive book I wrote on the craft of world building, which you can pick up on my website right now. Politics occupies a chunky section of the book, covering everything from governance structures and economics to social hierarchy and political symbology. And the book isn't just dry theory, it is packed with actionable exercises, real examples, and some truly gorgeous custom art, which looks great even in the black and white paperback edition. Because you're watching the series, I'm throwing in a special discount. If you use the code ICEBERG, all caps, the first 100 people will get a massive 20% off the paperback edition. Links to all of that are in the description down below. Now, back to your scheduled programming. Okay, so this is the part of the iceberg where we start getting quite far onto the dark side. This is where you have leaders in charge who might not have the best will of the people under them in mind, and certainly leaders who are not great on a personal level. This is quite a broad category, and Catherine Kerr falls right here for me. The Devery courts are actually quite brutal. They are deeply hierarchical, rigidly structured, and the nobles, generally speaking, are not super pleasant people. There is a magnificent storyline during the Westland cycle where they are working to put the true king, King Moraine, onto the throne. It's a stunning part of the series, but the more you uncover about Moraine as a person, the more you realize that while he might have some baseline ethics, and he tries to apply himself to the kingdom on a macro level, as an individual human being, he needs a short, sharp slap across the chops. He treats his wife incredibly poorly by constantly cheating on her. Now, sure, that's what high status men did at that time, but it's a lot less fun for the woman, and because she is a POV character, you are forced to feel the raw pain of that betrayal. Secondly, he starts an affair with a girl at the castle who happens to be in love with one of his loyal, high-ranking soldiers. To get the soldier out of the way, Moraine basically orders him back to the front lines of the war, just so that he can have a shot with the girl. It was such a cynical, self-serving move to put one of his most loyal men in a position where he might literally die, just so the king could get his rocks off. A little lower down in the exact same category, we have George R. R. Martin. Now, Martin does have some genuinely good people in his courts. As I spoke about in my previous video, Ned Stark was a profoundly good man for his era and his world. But look at the people surrounding him. Robert Baratheon might have started out his reign with relatively good intentions. But just like King Moraine in the Devery books, Robert became a worse person and a worse king the longer he sat on the throne, until he was basically an alcoholic with almost no moral lines, and his legal son, Joffrey, was an outright monster. These are courts defined by corrupt people in charge, deep systemic rot, and entrenched exploitation. They might steer toward a macro level goal that looks vaguely stable or goodish, but on an individual personal level, these are not the people you want in charge of your life. From a storyteller's perspective, these kinds of courts are magnificent for exploring human frailty and the corrupting nature of power. Power does inherently corrupt people by systemically stripping away their empathy. It distances them from the rest of humanity, making the elites believe that they achieve their wealth or power solely by their own merit. They adopt the mindset of, well, if I could do it, anyone could do it, and completely disregard structural advantages, luck, or inherited wealth. That is exactly what Catherine Kerr achieved with Moraine. She showed the corrupting influence of power on a character whom the reader watched grow up as a good kid, only to see him transform into a ruthless womanizer you wouldn't want anywhere near your daughters. With the Song of Ice and Fire, I think the story Martin is telling is that even if individuals are inherently good, it doesn't matter if the institutions themselves are fundamentally bad. If the system is so strictly hierarchical and toxic that there is no social mobility and that survival requires brutality, the good will always fail. That is my personal theory about Ned Stark's death. Ned died to prove to the audience that a good man cannot survive within a corrupt institution, because the corruption will inevitably weaponize his honor against them. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that bleak outlook as an absolute rule of life. I believe that institutional corruption can be beaten, and you can check out my video on corruption in world building to see exactly how you can play with that idea as a creator. But that dark institutional trap was precisely the story Martin wanted to tell, and his Midwater Court is the perfect stage for it. Next, we plunge into the deep water at the bottom of the iceberg. So, this is the darkest part of the iceberg. There is no honor, there is no glory, there is no divine right. There is only institutional rot, old men pulling the strings, and complete moral bankruptcy. For this level, we return to Joe Abercrombie. If we look at the court of the Union in Adao, the king is a drooling puppet. The actual court is run by the closed council, which is essentially an administrative engine of torture, debt collection, and cold hard calculations. It is completely stripped of any royal glamour. The grand savior figure of the realm is actually a ruthless ancient mage named Byers, who views the entire kingdom as nothing more than a bank account and a meat shield. And if we look at Abercrombie's new book, The Devils, we see a religious court that is heavily based on the historical papal court of Europe. And oh boy, are they corrupt. They cynically keep a stable of evil mythological creatures that are deployed as weapons whenever the church needs them. They will make whatever backroom deals they have to make in order to achieve the political aims of the people in charge. And they just don't care about the values they're supposed to uphold. They certainly don't care about their religion, for all that they will mouth the words and make the ritual signs. They are clearly in this game to maintain their own power and prestige and the prestige of their institution, rather than bring any glory to their god. Also in this category, I count the governance of Dune with the Landsraad, the Emperor, the Spicing Guild, and the Bene Gesserit. All of the politics in Dune are explicitly built on the premise of we are here for us, and you peasant, are just the resource that's going to die. It's deeply cynical. Warhammer 40k lives right down here as well with the High Lords of Terror. You have the emperor rotting on the golden throne, and surrounding him are elites who are very cynically using him to enforce a state religion, despite the fact that the emperor himself explicitly espoused a strictly secular anti-religion perspective when he was alive. It's a profoundly power-hungry court dedicated entirely to maintaining its own status. These elites will use and abuse any law, break any norm, as long as they can get away with it to enrich themselves. To them, that is the only reason the court exists and the only reason the world exists. From a writing perspective, these kinds of courts are great for telling stories about deep, systemic corruption and for highlighting the raw struggle of everyday people trapped in this kind of environment. If you are not part of the elite, how do you survive in a world like this? I think that was one of the most interesting aspects of The Devils to me. One of our protagonists is just a girl from the streets trying to cope in a world of high-level elites, and it is absolute insanity. The more she uncovers, the more she realizes that these high and mighty nobles are no different from common street thugs. They just have infinitely more power than street thugs. To me, that was the core message of that setting, the sheer thuggery that gets applied at the elite level. Now, I am not so cynical that I believe that this is true for our real world, at least not in all governments all the time. But it is an incredibly fascinating theme to explore as a fiction writer, the absolute depths to which corruption can drag us, and the structural toll it inflicts on a society when the ruling class falls to that extent. So, here we are at the bottom of the iceberg. And is this the bottom of the video? No. Next, the Marianna Trench. These are courts that, frankly, I think really only exist in the realm of epic fantasy itself. Your straight-up, unapologetically evil courts. To explore this, I'm actually going to draw on both of our earlier Waterline authors, Tolkien and Jacqueline Carey, because both of them also wrote some of the darkest, most vile courts imaginable. These are courts that make absolutely no pretense of being anything other than what they are. Systems engineered purely on absolute malice of mortals and dark divinities. In Tolkien's case, this is the court of Sauron himself, with the Nazgul and the mouth of Sauron and all of his terrifying captains. This is an entire institutional hierarchy based solely on those who believe in nothing but power and using that power to inflict themselves upon humanity and reduce everyone else to mere playthings. Similarly, in Jacqueline Carey's third book, Shield's Avatar, the protagonists encounter the horrific court of the Markigar in the mountain fortress of Darsanga. This setting is heavily based on ancient Zoroastrian mythology and its cosmic duality. You have the good god Ahura Mazda and the evil god Angry Manyu. In Carey's world, Angry Manyu is locked behind a mystical doorway, but if that door is ever opened, it will unleash 1,000 years of literal and spiritual darkness upon the earth. The Markigar has deliberately made himself that doorway, cracking it open so that his entire court can be built on the active worship of Angry Manyu and the literal creed of ill thoughts, ill words, ill deeds. And let me tell you, it is a profoundly vile court. They burn dogs for sport. At one point, the Markigar takes 2 captured priests of Ahura Mazda and treats them like ponies. His warriors sit on the backs of these 2 old men and charge at each other to fight. People die every single night in his great hall just battling each other for the Markigar's personal amusement. He will force enslaved women from his seraglio to fight to the death, or casually toss them to his soldiers to be assaulted right there on the banquet tables. It was truly a deprived, nightmarish environment. Now, writing an environment this extreme makes for great storytelling in both authors' cases because it perfectly sets up a titanic clash between good and evil. If that is the foundational story you want to tell, having a court this monstrous gives your heroes the ultimate antagonist to overcome. But it also allows a writer to explore a very interesting, highly realistic psychological effect: the people who choose to make their peace with a nightmare. It allows you to showcase the characters who look at a monstrosity and say, well, it might not be nice, but I need to survive. I need to get my bag. If I don't go along with the Markigar, I won't get my revenge on the people I hate, I won't get the land I want, and I won't survive. It explores the go along to get along mentality, where people simply close their eyes, choose not to look too closely, and accept that the world is just inherently harsh. This was incredibly evident throughout Carrie's Darsanga storyline. So many of the neighboring factions and nations had either completely given up trying to resist this evil court, or they had actively started working with it because, well, the Markigar was the one in power. He offers practical opportunities, and if you can stomach the daily brutality, you can carve out a piece of wealth for yourself. It was a deeply uncomfortable look at human nature under pressure. And to me, that is the very bottom of the Marianna Trench, the darkest, most terrifying abyss of fantasy world building, where courts are built on pure, unadulterated evil, and people work alongside it. And now, while the epic members of the channel scroll past, the incredible humans who make this channel possible and get early, ad-free access to my content, let me tell you about the kind of court I like to build in my own fiction and why. Personally, I love a court that blends right at the waterline with maybe a shade or two below. This is where you encounter a bit of corruption, a touch of institutional rot, and a healthy dose of cynicism and political maneuvering, but there is still hope. I do not love the completely sunlit court at the very top, because to me that feels unrealistic. But I genuinely prefer a slightly more hopeful style of politics than the pitch black darkness you find as you slide down toward the Martin and Abercrombie line in the deeper parts of the iceberg. The reason for this is simple. I feel like looking at fictional politics with absolute cynicism trains us to look at our own real-world politics with that same absolute cynicism. And yes, of course, politicians are not always the best people. Believe me, I get that. Pol Pot, Moustache Guy, and so on. Even the current evening news gives us heaps of examples of politicians failing us. But those are often systemic failures rather than proof that humanity is inherently evil. See, my problem with saying that all politics is inherently corrupt is that applying a blanket level of total cynicism can easily lead to despair. And I don't want people to despair of real-world politics. I want people to be involved in real-world politics. I want us to work together to make the actual world a better place, a place where people can live in safety and freedom. Because of that, I don't particularly like to go full grim dark in my writing, unless I have a very specific story to tell on how to counter that darkness or find a way out of it. I don't think I could ever write stories like Joe Abercrombie does, where the narrative essentially ends in tragedy. That is not to say that I dislike Abercrombie. I don't at all. I read his books, I thoroughly enjoy them. But that bleakness isn't something I would ever want to write myself. My own stories tend to steer towards being more hopeful because, despite my own cynicism, I possess a fundamental hope for humanity. And I think that that is a hopeful note to end on. If you have made it this far into the depths of the iceberg with me, leave me a sun emoji in the comments for the sake of optimism. And if you want more deep dive world building analysis from me, you can check out my previous iceberg video on fantasy governments, which covers everything from absolute kingdoms all the way down to artificial minds. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon for another episode.